By a show of hands, how many have heard of Charles Blondin? Charles Blondin? Oh, great. Nobody. He's a French tightrope walker who earned global acclaim in 1859 when he came to the United States and he crossed Niagara Falls on a tightrope, 1,100 feet from one side of Niagara Falls to the other on a tightrope suspended 160 feet above the falls. He walked back and forth. He did it once on stilts, another time on a bicycle, and for his grand finale, he put a sack of potatoes in a wheelbarrow and pushed that wheelbarrow across the falls and back. And upon his return, the crowd in the stands stood up and gave him a thundering standing ovation. And when the excitement died down, Blondin leaned in and asked them, "Do you believe I can do it again?" And they said, "Yes, of course, you're the greatest." He said, "Then get in the wheelbarrow." All three of our readings today speak of faith, about getting in the wheelbarrow. And I want to examine faith from three perspectives offered by the readings. First, faith doesn't ask why, but who. And second, faith's greatest power isn't necessarily the power to change things, but the power to endure things as they are. And three, that faith is enough. So first, faith doesn't ask why, but who. So Habakkuk, in our first reading, is crying out to God. He's living at a desperate time. Jerusalem's leaders are all corrupt. The people are worshiping false gods, and the culture is rife with injustice and violence, and he sees it everywhere. And finally, he cries out to God, "Why? How long are you going to let this go on? Why aren't you doing something about it?" And God's answer to Habakkuk is, "I have a plan. I have a vision. It will surely come. Even if it's delayed, wait for it. It will come. As a matter of fact, you can write this in stone." Almost like reminding Habakkuk that I am the God who led Israel out of Egypt after 400 years of slavery. God's telling Habakkuk, you can trust me, you can count on me, get in the wheelbarrow with me. Second, faith's greatest power isn't the power to necessarily change things, although God does at times. But faith's greatest power is the power to endure things as they are. To endure tragedy when it hits. When it feels like someone just drove a truck right through the middle of your heart. The loss of a job, a home, loss of a child, a spouse. Hearing the word cancer fall out of your doctor's mouth. Living with a loved one in their addiction. Suffering is the most common human experience. And when we first encounter suffering, our first tendency is to ask why. And at the end of the day, there is no adequate explanation for suffering. And the only thing that makes suffering bearable is not an answer to the unanswerable question of why, but Jesus, who is in the suffering with us. The same Jesus who went to the cross for us will go anywhere with us. The same Jesus who went to the most horrific place on the planet, the crucifixion, for us. Will not that Jesus go any place with us? Jesus with us is the power to endure things as they are. Our second reading, Paul is writing to Timothy. And Paul is in prison. He's facing death. And Timothy would be fearing for his own life. For one, he's a follower of Jesus. And two, he's associated with Paul. And Paul's trial is not going well. And Paul knows that his days are limited. Later in the same letter, Paul writes this to Timothy: I've fought the good fight. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. Now there is in store for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day. This is not a man who's expecting God to change his circumstances. No, Paul is accepting those circumstances in faith, and he's encouraging Timothy to endure the hardships set before him, to stir the flame of faith alive that was given to him. We get in the wheelbarrow and in faith allow God to carry us through our greatest difficulties and challenges and the most treacherous moments in our life. Faith is not the power to just change things necessarily. Faith is the power to endure things as they are. And third, faith is enough. Which brings us to this kind of odd part of the text. I find it odd anyway in Luke. It's an odd part of the text. Jesus tells the story of an abusive master and his servant who all in the same day goes out and plows the field, tends the sheep, and then he must come back physically exhausted, and he's expected to prepare a meal and serve that meal to his master. Deserving of nothing, just doing a servant's duty. Now, Jesus isn't approving of this abusive master's behavior. He's using an example very familiar to his audience to show what my attitude should be toward God. I'm always in debt to God. How can I repay God for everything that he's done for me? And yet too many times I get a little proud and a little puffed up about all the good work I do for him. Friends that we've known for nearly 20 years were over for dinner last week, and Kathy, toward the end of the evening, Kathy was reflecting, looking back over her years spent working in a specific area of social justice, particularly in the church, without a lot of success. And having fewer years ahead of her than those that were behind her, she said to me, Steve, I will never know the contributions that I've made in this. It might be years after I'm gone before anything changes. But my role is to simply pour out my life. And that's enough. She said, for her, knowing that God accepts her offering and in his time will make it fruitful is enough. She said, I am content to live in that mystery. Kathy wasn't looking for recognition or even success, just the faith that nothing is wasted in God's hands was enough. And to get in the wheelbarrow and allow God to take me wherever he wants me to be, even though I may never see the fruit of my life poured out. Living a life of this kind of faith is not easy. These things are not easy. I've struggled and I continue to struggle for a life of this kind of faith. It isn't easy to see injustice, especially in our church, and not question God. It isn't easy to not see fruit from our hard work, a life poured out, and to continue to get up day in, day out, turn the crank, and just continue in the struggle. And it is especially difficult to live this kind of faith in the midst of suffering. To live this kind of faith when you feel like someone just drove a truck right through the middle of your heart. Which is why the apostles' request of Jesus today in Luke's gospel is one of my favorite prayers. Lord, increase my faith. Jesus, increase my faith so I learn to ask who instead of interrogating you about the why. Jesus, increase my faith so that with you at my side, I might endure things as they are. Increase my faith, Jesus, so it is enough to pour out my life as an offering to you. Amen.